Chapter 1. Song, stop arguing with me about Fei Fei. She's my younger sister. You should treat her like your own and dote on her. My wife, Sun Lily, said to me impatiently with a cold expression. All right, consider it done. I replied without hesitation. I'll definitely dote on Fei Fei from now on and absolutely won't argue with you about her again. My wife nodded in satisfaction and then linked arms with me as we went home. Back home, my sister-in-law, Sun Fei Fei, was lying on the sofa in her pajamas, looking disheveled, scrolling through her phone. My 6-year-old son, a first grader, was sitting at the coffee table doing his homework. My wife was checking our son's homework while I took the groceries into the kitchen to prepare dinner. Before long, I had finished making braised pork ribs and sweet and sour pork tenderloin, along with 2 stir-fried vegetables. I brought them to the dining table and announced, "Dinner's ready." My wife took our son to the bathroom to wash their hands. I went back to the kitchen to wash my hands. By the time the 3 of us sat down at the dining table, Sun Fei Fei was already there, helping herself to the food. In the past, I would frown at such a scene. I would also take the opportunity to talk to my wife, asking her to talk to Sun Fei Fei. After all, such impolite and ill-mannered behavior, once it becomes a habit, would reflect poorly on her in social situations. While others might not say anything to her face, they definitely wouldn't want to have close relationships with someone so impolite and ill-mannered. The reason I asked my wife to talk to her was naturally because Sun Fei Fei is her younger sister. As her brother-in-law, it wasn't appropriate for me to say certain things, but it was fine for her own sister to do so. Most of the time, my wife would agree with me and say she'd talk to Sun Fei Fei. As for whether she actually did or not, I never saw it. However, Sun Fei Fei's impolite and ill-mannered behavior never changed. Sometimes, when I mentioned it too often, my wife would get annoyed and argue with me, telling me to mind my own business. Just after work today, when my wife and I went grocery shopping together, I brought up the old topic again. Sun Fei Fei stayed at our house all day, doing nothing but scrolling through her phone. It wasn't just for a day or two, but for over a year, almost 2 years now. No one could stand that, right? This time, my wife became extremely impatient and said the words from the beginning of this story. Since that was the case, what else was there to say? Fei Fei, eat more. I picked up a piece of sweet and sour pork tenderloin and put it in Sun Fei Fei's bowl. The pork tenderloin we bought today is especially tender. Too much sugar. I'll get fat. Sun Fei Fei picked the sweet and sour pork tenderloin out of her bowl and dropped it onto the table. Annie, wasting food is shameful. My 6-year-old son, just a first grader, couldn't stand Sun Fei Fei's behavior. Little brat, mind your own business. Eat your food. She even raised her hand to threaten him. Only then did my wife, Sun Lily, intervene, but she only said, "Hurry up and eat. Then have more ribs." These ribs are braised, not greasy at all. I picked a piece of rib that was all lean meat and put it in Sun Fei Fei's bowl. This one is good. All lean. Dad, why don't you give me and Mom some food? You only give Annie food. My son looked up at me, pouting his lips in dissatisfaction. Dad's playing favorites. Chapter 2. Nonsense. I scolded my son with a stern face. Your aunt is your mom's younger sister, which means she's my younger sister too. We're all family. How can you say I'm being biased just because I gave your aunt some food? However, while I was scolding my son, I was actually giving him a thumbs up in my mind. At the same time, I glanced at my wife from the corner of my eye. My wife's expression remained unchanged. It seems she also thought my son was wrong to accuse me of being biased, and she genuinely believed that giving Sun Fei Fei food and what I said were right. Sis, I want some water, Sun Fei Fei said while gnawing on a rib. My wife immediately put down her chopsticks and was about to pour Sun Fei Fei some water. In the past, I would definitely not have gotten up in this situation. Even when I was very angry, I might have coldly said something like, "Pour it yourself." However, this time, I immediately jumped up, stopped my wife, and said, I'll do it. Then, I happily poured Sun Fei Fei a glass of water and said, "It's a little hot. Drink slowly." As I handed it to her, my wife smiled at me. I could tell her smile was genuine. The reason for her happiness was simple. She had told me to treat her sister like my own and to dote on son Fei Fei. Not only had I listened, but I had also taken it to heart and demonstrated it through my actions. A husband listens to his wife. How could a wife not be happy? I returned my wife's smile, but silently thought to myself, "Wife, the show has just begun. Let's see if you can stand it. If you can, I'll admit defeat." Before long, Sun Fei Fei finished eating, put her dishes on the table, and went back to the living room to lie on the sofa and scroll through her phone. After the three of us finished eating, my wife cleared the table and went to the kitchen to wash the dishes, while I took my son to take a bath. From the division of labor between my wife and me, it's easy to see that our life is quite harmonious. This is mainly because my wife and I have a deep affection for each other. Neither of us are from this city. We attended university here, and we met, got to know each other, and fell in love on campus. Before graduation, we had a discussion about our future plans. Neither of us wanted to go back home. We wanted to stay in this city. So, neither of us chose to go to graduate school. Instead, we found jobs as office workers right after graduating. Fortunately, we both worked hard and saved diligently. After a year, we pooled our savings, and with some help from my parents, we made a down payment on a house in this city. My wife's family is quite ordinary, and with son Fei Fei, her younger sister, they couldn't help us financially with buying a house. Because of this, my wife initially disagreed when my parents offered to help us with the down payment. However, we did need their help to make the down payment, so my wife compromised and wrote them an IOU. We consider the money a loan from my parents, even though my parents repeatedly told my wife that they only have me as their child and that all their savings would be mine after they were gone. So there was no need to repay the loan. My wife still made a plan to budget a portion of her salary each month to repay my parents. To have such a wife, what more could a husband ask for? How could I not cherish her after all she has done? Chapter 3. My parents couldn't persuade my wife otherwise and accepted the money she returned, wanting to secretly transfer it back to me. I refused as well. One reason was, as they said, they only have me as their child. Wouldn't all their savings be mine eventually? Whether the money is with them or me makes no difference. Another reason was that I was afraid my wife would be angry if she found out. From the fact that she wrote an IOU to my parents and actually repaid the money, it's clear she's a very independent person. There's no need for me to stir up trouble. I don't know if it's heaven's blessing, but both my wife's and my careers went smoothly. We both got promoted, and our salaries increased significantly. Soon after, we got our house, renovated it, and 3 years after graduation, we held our wedding and welcomed the birth of our son. More than once, I sincerely thanked God in my heart for giving me such a good wife and a peaceful, stable life. Before my son turned 4, my wife and I never had a single argument. Neither of us wanted a second child, and I thought this peaceful happiness would last a lifetime. But life is never smooth sailing. There are always ups and downs, bumps in the road, aren't there? About 2 years ago, my peaceful and happy married life was shattered by the arrival of my sister-in-law, Sun Fei Fei. She went to university in a city neighboring ours and had stayed at our place for a few days during weekends or short holidays. Back then, I wasn't so annoyed with her. After all, it was only for 3 to 5 days at most, and she was my sister-in-law. As her brother-in-law, of course, I had to take good care of her. But this time was completely different. She graduated from university and planned to come to the city where my wife and I lived to develop her career, hoping to settle down here like us. I certainly had no objection to her plan. My wife's family only has the two of them as sisters. If Sun Fei Fei could settle down in our city, it would be easier for them to support each other, wouldn't it? Moreover, both our parents were getting older, and my wife and I had discussed that it would be best for them to move to our city so we could take care of them in their old age. Sun Fei Fei coming to our city to develop her career and settle down here would be even better. But who could have imagined that Sun Fei Fei would end up staying at our house for almost 2 years? During these 2 years, she didn't pay for living expenses, didn't do any chores, and lived at our place completely free of charge. My wife and I had just finished paying off our mortgage, and after deducting living expenses, we used to have some savings every month. But with the added expense of another person, Not only did our monthly savings disappear, but we occasionally found ourselves short of money. In other words, Sun Feifei's stay at our house put a certain amount of financial pressure on us. During these 2 years, she did go out to look for jobs, but every time she would come running home after only a few days with all sorts of excuses. My wife believed all her excuses and comforted her constantly. I had my doubts and didn't quite believe her. How could someone not be suitable for several jobs in a row? So, I asked a friend to find her a job. Chapter 4. Considering my sister-in-law as a woman, I specifically asked my friend to find her a job that wasn't too strenuous. My friend came through and found her a clerical position with a trial period salary of $6,000, increasing to $8,000 after becoming permanent, with room and board provided in the employee dormitory and cafeteria. Who knew? After only 3 days, my sister-in-law came running back, complaining about the poor dormitory, the bad cafeteria food, and the low salary. I immediately understood what was happening. A typical case of high expectations and low abilities. After my wife consoled her, she blamed me for finding Sun Feifei a bad job. That time, I didn't argue with my wife. Instead, I told her that I had done my best, and if she wasn't satisfied with this job, I didn't have the connections to find her a better one right away. So the matter of Sun Feifei finding a job was dropped. But she continued living with us, eating and drinking for free, which put a financial strain on us. Couldn't she at least help out with some chores? For example, since both my wife and I work, couldn't she cook dinner before we got home, so we could have a warm meal? Or clean the house while we're at work? These aren't difficult tasks. But every time I asked Sun Feifei to do something, my wife would protect her, saying that her sister hadn't found a suitable job yet and was very sensitive. Saying anything more would lead to an argument. I've earnestly discussed this with my wife, explaining that her sister is a typical giant baby and needs to grow up quickly. Otherwise, as she gets older, she'll become truly useless. I also told my wife that by pampering her sister, she's not helping her, but harming her. But to my surprise, my usually decisive wife was completely unreasonable on this issue. She didn't disagree with what I said, but she just couldn't bring herself to do anything differently, continuing to spoil Sun Feifei without any change. Perhaps this is related to the fact that my wife is 6 or 7 years older than her sister. Whatever the reason for my wife's uncharacteristic lack of reason, the problem remains. My giant baby sister-in-law, Sun Feifei, is still living in our house with no intention of leaving. I'm desperate to resolve this because my son is 6 years old and has started elementary school. My wife and I have been sharing a bed with him, and we plan to have him sleep separately once he started school. But our apartment only has 2 bedrooms. Sun Feifei has taken over the second bedroom, leaving no place for my son to sleep, so he has to continue sharing a bed with us. My son is growing up every day, and my sister-in-law still hasn't moved out and shows no signs of doing so. When will this end? This situation needs to stop so we can return to our happy and stable family life. In other words, the problem of my giant baby sister-in-law living in our house must be solved. Chapter 5. After I finished bathing my son, it was my sister-in-law's turn. My wife would soothe our son to sleep during this time and wait for my sister-in-law to finish before taking her own shower. As for me, I'm always the last to bathe every night. My company is quite far from home, so I don't come back for lunch and can't pick up our son. My wife's company is closer, allowing her to bring him home for lunch. Therefore, I usually drop him off at school in the morning before work, and my wife picks him up at noon. I pick him up again after work in the afternoon. As for my sister-in-law, Sun Feifei, as I mentioned before, she's a giant baby. She's been living at our place for almost 2 years, doing nothing but eating and drinking all day. Even something as small as picking up my son, she won't do it. Of course, I've asked her to help, but as always, my wife protects her and immediately rejects my request. After picking up my son from school, I stopped by the fruit store and bought some fruit to bring home. At dinner, I served Sun Feifei food, just like yesterday, and my wife didn't react. After dinner, instead of letting my wife do the dishes, I washed them myself. Then, I washed and cut the fruit, arranged it on a platter, and poured yogurt over it from the fridge. "Fruit time," I announced, carrying the fruit platter into the living room and placing it on the coffee table. My son immediately grabbed a toothpick and skewered a piece of apple, popping it into his mouth. I also took a toothpick, stabbed a piece of pineapple, and held it up to son Feifei, saying, "Here, Feifei, your favorite pineapple." Son Feifei was glued to her phone, her eyes never leaving the screen as she tilted her head slightly and opened her mouth towards me. I quickly fed her the pineapple. While chewing, she said, "Brother-in-law, this pineapple is really good. So sweet, not sour at all." Of course, these pineapples are only the size of a fist. The owner of the fruit store told me they're imported, I said with a smile, feeding her another piece while glancing at my wife. Although she didn't say anything, she frowned. Seeing this, I became even more attentive to son Feifei. "Dad, Annie's eating too fast. Don't feed her anymore," my son protested. "If you keep feeding Annie, she'll eat everything. You can have all of this," my wife said with a smile, pulling the fruit platter towards our son. There wasn't much left. Son Feifei didn't object when my wife gave the rest to our son. I tossed my toothpick in the trash and suggested, "It's the weekend tomorrow, let's go to the mall. It feels like we haven't gone shopping in ages." Okay. Hearing the word mall, son Feifei immediately put down her phone and chimed in, "I need some new clothes. I'll see if there are any new styles." My son raised his hand and added, "I want to eat that lamb we had before." He was talking about the boiled lamb, very tender and delicious, but a bit expensive. Before son Feifei moved in, we had a little surplus every month and no real financial pressure, so we took our son to eat it almost every month. Since she arrived, our financial burden has increased, and we haven't been back. My wife had been about to object when her sister excitedly agreed to go clothes shopping, but after hearing our son's request, she fell silent. Chapter 6. My wife's silence was taken as agreement, and so our weekend mall trip was settled. After our son fell asleep, my wife whispered to me, "Aren't you being a little too attentive to Feifei? Do you really need to feed her fruit?" "What are you talking about?" I retorted, glancing at her. "She's your sister, which makes her my sister. Isn't it natural for me to dote on her?" That single sentence shut my wife up. After all, those were her words, her request that I dote on son Feifei. The next morning, a little after 9, the three of us, plus my sister-in-law, set off from home. The mall we were headed to was a good 30-minute drive. Luckily, the traffic was smooth, and we arrived without a hitch. After parking, we strolled into the mall. "Here, Feifei, give me your bag. I'll carry it for you, so you can just focus on shopping," I said to son Feifei as we entered. She readily handed over her bag and made a beeline for the women's clothing stores. My wife also had a bag, but I was already carrying Feifei's and holding our son's hand. Seeing my wife look at me, I said, "Carry your own. It's not convenient for me to hold two bags and the kid." Although she didn't say anything or give me her bag, I could detect a hint of annoyance in her eyes. We've been married for so many years, we know each other so well, it's easy to pick up on these things. We browsed 2 stores. As we were leaving the second one, Feifei's shoelace came undone. I immediately stopped her from walking further and bent down to tie it. Standing up, I said, "All good. Let's keep shopping." "Miss, your husband is so thoughtful. I'm so envious," the saleswoman at the entrance of the store chimed in. "What a perfect assist." I mentally applauded the saleswoman and glanced at my wife from the corner of my eye, noticing a flash of anger on her face. "He's not my husband, he's my brother-in-law," Feifei clarified. Her explanation only made things worse. The saleswoman covered her mouth in surprise, then quickly apologized. "I'm so sorry. I misunderstood." Before Feifei could say anything else, my wife cut in. "Let's go. Let's check out the store up ahead." She grabbed Feifei's arm and walked briskly forward. I followed with our son, strolling into the next store. The clothes in this shop were stylish and of excellent quality. Even on the hangers, they looked luxurious. I casually glanced at the price tag of a sweater nearby. $1,288. And that was just for a thin sweater. Chapter 7. My wife and my sister-in-law entered the shop, their eyes clearly sparkling with excitement. It was obvious they both liked the style and quality of the clothes. This wasn't surprising. Women love to shop for clothes, and who doesn't appreciate nice things? The saleswoman was naturally very enthusiastic, constantly introducing their clothes, talking about famous designers and fabrics, exaggerating everything, and repeatedly urging them to try anything they liked. Although my wife liked the clothes after seeing the price tags, she shook her head and declined the saleswoman's kind offer to try them on. After all, if she tried on something she really liked and it looked even better on her, but she couldn't afford it, wouldn't it be even more painful? My sister-in-law, Sun Feifei, didn't have these concerns. She took a fancy to a long, loose trench coat, and under the saleswoman's persuasive words, quickly took the same coat in her size into the fitting room. Sis, how is it? Does it look good? Sun Feifei asked my wife while turning left and right in front of the mirror, wearing the trench coat. It looks good. My wife's eyes brightened, she nodded, and then changed the subject, saying, Feifei, we just got here, let's go look around first. The saleswoman clearly saw through my wife's delaying tactic and immediately began to praise how amazing Sun Feifei looked in the trench coat, exaggerating the effect of the garment and complimenting my sister-in-law to the skies. To be fair, though, the trench coat really was nice, otherwise it wouldn't have looked so good on her. Sun Feifei clearly wanted to buy the trench coat, but she didn't have the money. She looked at my wife with pleading eyes, hoping she would buy it for her. My wife, well aware of our financial situation, found the price of the trench coat unbearable and pretended not to see Sun Feifei's pleading look. If you like it, buy it, I said at this moment. My wife and sister-in-law both looked at me. My wife's face was filled with surprise, while Sun Feifei's face was filled with joy. Brother-in-law, are you really buying it for me? Yes, wrap it up, I said to the saleswoman beside Sun Feifei. The saleswoman immediately and efficiently wrapped up the trench coat and gave me the receipt. I took the receipt and went to the cashier to pay. The trench coat was 5,888 yuan, and the store gave a 15% discount, so I paid 5,004. 80 yuan. Although I didn't hand over my salary to my wife, she knew how much I earned, and my wife carefully planned our monthly expenses based on both our salaries. In other words, although I held my salary, my wife essentially controlled how it was spent. Therefore, Sun Feifei knew that my wife held the purse strings in our family. Seeing me actually pay for the 5,000 yuan trench coat, Sun Feifei's face was ecstatic. She didn't think about where the money came from. She only cared about getting the trench coat. Thank you, brother-in-law. You're the best. Sun Feifei took the trench coat from the saleswoman, and in her excitement, hugged me and kissed me on the cheek. Then, she grabbed the coat and my son and rushed out of the shop, as if afraid I would change my mind. My wife's face had completely darkened. Chapter 8. Since we were in a public place like a mall, my wife, though furious, didn't explode. She just stormed out of the store with a dark expression. As soon as I followed her out, she asked coldly, "Where did you get the money to buy clothes for Feifei?" "Where did I get it?" I asked, feigning surprise. "My salary, of course. It was paid 2 days early this month. Otherwise, why would I have suggested coming to the mall?" "What did you say?" My wife stopped, glared at me, and asked, "You used your salary to buy Feifei clothes?" "Yeah." I put on a puzzled look and asked, "What's wrong?" Of course, the puzzled look was fake. "I manage all your salary. It's for household expenses. You spent 5,000 on a single piece of clothing for Feifei. We probably won't even have enough money for groceries this month. Are we supposed to live on air? You didn't tell me how to allocate my salary this month, so I assumed it wasn't needed." I mumbled in response. At this point, there was no use in her getting angrier. She sighed and said, "Even if you were buying clothes for Feifei, you shouldn't have bought something so expensive." I pursed my lips and remained silent. Seeing my expression, my wife glared at me again. "Let me tell you, you're being too good to my sister. Do you have some other motive?" Hearing this, I immediately feigned offense. "What are you thinking? She's your younger sister. I treat her like my own. Besides, you're the one who told me to treat her like my own sister and dote on her." I simply threw her own words back at her, leaving her speechless. After all, those were her exact words, and she'd said them just 2 days ago. Even the worst memory couldn't forget something from 2 days ago, right? Moreover, my wife has an exceptionally good memory. Our son was waving to us from a short distance away. My wife didn't say anything more. She just glared at me again and walked towards our son and son Fei. I sauntered after them. As things stood, the situation was excellent. From serving son Fei food, to feeding her fruit, holding her bag at the mall, squatting down to tie her shoelaces, and now spending 5,000 on a trench coat for her. Everything was deliberate. My wife told me to treat son Fei like my own sister and dote on her. I did everything she asked. Now she's saying I'm being too good to son Fei. Can't blame me for that, can she? Otherwise, she wouldn't have been rendered speechless when I threw her own words back at her. I wanted to see just how much my wife could tolerate my being so good to her sister. Again, if she could actually tolerate it, I'd accept it and let that giant baby, son Fei, continue living in my house. Chapter 9. Our family of 3, plus my sister-in-law son Fei, shopped until noon and ate boiled mutton and ice, which my son wanted in the mall. My son was clearly craving the boiled mutton and ice, to the point that he ate until he was quite full, his little belly round and bulging. Fortunately, mutton is easy to digest, so he wouldn't have indigestion. After leaving the restaurant, my son kept muttering, "Mom, we used to eat this mutton a lot. Why haven't you brought me here for so long?" Faced with my son's question, a complicated expression flashed across my wife's face. She didn't answer his question directly, instead saying, "Mom will bring you here often in the future." "Really?" my son asked happily. "Really?" Although my wife was nodding and smiling, there was a firmness in her eyes, as if she had made some kind of decision. Walking behind them, I secretly gave my son's small back a thumbs up. This kid gave a great assist. After returning home in the afternoon, I wanted to rest, but my wife asked me to take my son downstairs to play. Without asking any questions, I took my son downstairs to the community fitness area and let him run around with the other children. I sat to the side, smoking and chatting with a few other dads. Moms watch kids cautiously, while dads just let them play, as long as nothing goes wrong. After about 2 hours, my wife messaged me to bring our son home. When I brought my son home, my wife was sitting on the living room sofa. I didn't see my sister-in-law son Fei, and the spare bedroom door was closed, so I figured she was in there. "What's wrong?" I quickly asked, seeing my wife's angry expression. "I had a fight with Fei, my wife replied. I gave her 2 choices. Either go out and find a job or go home. This. I was ecstatic inside, but put on a worried expression on my face and said, "Is this okay?" "Nothing's wrong with it." My wife glanced at our son with some guilt and said, "With Fei living in our house, I even stopped buying our son his favorite boiled mutton and ice because of the financial pressure. Look how much he craved it today." My wife couldn't continue, wiping away tears. "One meal of boiled mutton and ice doesn't cost that much. 3 adults and 1 child. It was only about 800 yuan, I said thoughtfully. "We can tighten our belts a bit more. We can squeeze out some money to take our son to eat boiled mutton and ice. There's no need to go this far. She's your sister after all, isn't she?" Hearing this, my wife glanced at the closed door of the spare bedroom, lowered her voice, and said, "Stop with the fake sympathy. I'm not blind. You've been deliberately nice to her these past few days, just to spite me, haven't you? You're being unreasonable." I roll my eyes. "You want me to treat her like..." All right, stop trying to be smart with me." My wife knew I was about to repeat her words back to her and immediately interrupted me, preventing me from continuing. Chapter 10. Hearing my wife say this, I chuckled and didn't say anything more. My wife patted the sofa beside her, and I immediately went over and sat down. She put her arm around mine, rested her head lightly on my shoulder, and whispered, "Honey, I'm sorry." Hearing her apology, I immediately straightened up and asked, "What are you apologizing for?" "I know you were right. Fei is a giant baby." My wife sighed helplessly. "I also know I should have done what you said and made Fei go out and get a job, otherwise she really would become useless. But I just couldn't bring myself to do it, and I even got annoyed and argued with you when you were kindly reminding me." "Admitting your mistakes means you're still a good comrade," I said, putting on airs. Seeing me like this, my wife laughed and lightly punched me. I chuckled and whispered, "Honey, you're usually such a decisive and reasonable person. Why are you so stubbornly unreasonable when it comes to Fei? I'm really curious why." "I'm 6 years older than her," my wife said after thinking for a moment. "It's been hard for me as her older sister, and I don't want her to suffer as much as I did. I don't want her to work so hard. I guess that's the psychology at play." I nodded silently. Ultimately, it was the older sister's love for her younger sister. However, this kind of love could lead to spoiling and have a negative effect rather than a positive one. Emotions versus logic. It was nothing more than a clash between these two aspects. Regarding son Fei being a giant baby, I was simply on the side of logic, while my wife was on the side of emotion. There was no need to dwell on who was right or wrong, as long as the problem was solved. And regarding the issue of my giant baby sister-in-law, son Fei, constantly living in my house and refusing to move out, my wife was the main problem that needed to be addressed. If it weren't for her, as the older sister, constantly protecting son Fei, how could she have stayed in our house for so long? Now that my wife had finally had a showdown with her sister and given her two choices, I believed the problem would be resolved soon. After all, I had said more than once that my wife was a very decisive person. Once she made a decision, it was difficult for her to change it. Just as I expected, my wife only gave her sister one night to think it over. The next day, Sunday, my wife ordered her out of her room to give her an answer. Son Fei still wanted to continue her giant baby lifestyle, unwilling to work or go home. She started throwing a tantrum and crying nonstop in my house, even appealing to me for help. I didn't see whether or not my wife scolded her. I immediately hid in the bedroom. Son Fei pleaded with my wife again, but this time, my wife had made up her mind and remained indifferent to her pleas. Finally, son Fei had no choice but to make a choice as my wife had instructed. She chose to go out and work. After receiving her sister's answer, my wife gave son Fei an ultimatum. She had to find a job within a week, go to work, and couldn't continue living in our house. Even if it meant sweeping the streets, she had to work. Regarding son Fei's job, I couldn't bear it and helped her out in the end, finding her another job. However, I didn't show my face. Instead, I had my wife presented as if she had found the job. My wife personally took son Fei to the company where my friend had offered the job and told her that if she didn't take this job, she shouldn't bother coming to our house again. From that day on, our home finally returned to its previous peaceful happiness. I also reminded my friend that my sister-in-law was a bit of a giant baby and asked them to educate her more. A few months later, my sister-in-law came to our house again. Unlike before, she didn't come empty-handed and move in. Instead, she bought toys for my son, cigarettes for me, and clothes for my wife. Undoubtedly, this change in son Fei indicated that the giant baby attribute was gradually disappearing from her.